Okay, hello and welcome to the first video lecture series that goes along with your textbook. Hopefully by watching these videos, you'll get a deeper understanding of what you've read in the textbook and also some of the things that have changed since the textbook was written, things that we can add on to that. And again, hopefully these are going to be useful for you. So today we are starting with Chapter 1. And Chapter 1 really talks about the course itself and the idea of an overriding theme of the book and really all of the things that we're going to be doing with environmental science, and that's sustainability. So we'll talk about that. And we also want to talk about where we've maybe had some environmental issues and what might have caused them, and ultimately, hopefully, talk about solutions. So here we go. All right, well, one of the reasons that we have environmental issues is that we've got a lot of people. We've got a lot of people, and the human population is very successful. So it is growing by leaps and bounds. So a lot of people mean a lot of problems. Even before we get into this, that sentence itself, a lot of people means a lot of problems. It would be very good if you didn't just wait to hear the problems, but thought to yourself already, well, what are some of the problems? What are some of the solutions? What are some of the great things that have been happening so far? Always think when you hear a statement of what questions would be raised. And once you answer a question, then you start thinking about what other questions have been raised by the question you answered. And that's how your thought process is going to develop. Try to see as many connections as you can, and along the way, raise a lot of questions. There's a lot of things to think about with our topic here. So you can see here now that people have jumped up recently in population. For most of human existence, there wasn't as many people as there are now. It's been growing by leaps and bounds. And one of the big things that happened that helped people to jump up here was to discover agriculture. So now they could build cities around there. But now we've gotten into the Industrial Revolution, and there is just a lot of us on the planet. So we have to think about those issues. So if we're talking about those issues and those environmental issues, we need to understand the environment. Lots of different things go into this class here, and that's what our class is going to be. It's going to be talking about how the environment works without us, how we've affected it, and how we can maximize its use as well toward being, of course, sustainable. Lots of different things are going into this. So this isn't just a matter of you can say, hey, it's environmental science, or hey, it's just biology, or hey, you can imagine if you start asking those questions and trying to see those connections that there is a lot going on here. So these are not easy questions to answer maybe, and also they're going to shift as time goes on. It really depends. What is your philosophy? Well, now we have to make decisions for a group of people. This is going to get ourselves into politics. Is there things that are going on between different countries that are going to have something to do with environmental issues? And now that's political. And boy, you got a lot of things that you can be thinking about there. So right from the beginning, you got a lot to tie in. I think that that's one of the big benefits of this class, is that it really shows you how the world is connected. And the more you look into it, the more you know, and the more you see how it is connected. But that's also part of the challenge of this class. There's so much to tie in here. So we'll start, and we'll just do some good work all year long. Okay, so as I already said a couple times, sustainability is a big part of what we're talking about. So you want to be thinking about what sustainability means, and really we're in it for the long haul, I guess. So we want the planet to be nice, we want life to be nice for ourselves and for our children and our children's children, or the next generation, or however it plays out. We like the human race to go on sustainably. So we have to think about that as we're making decisions now. Okay, so here are the basics here. Again, we want to know how nature works, and then we want to know how we're affecting nature and are affected by nature. So here's some terms to be thinking about, and that's natural capital. So this is what nature does for us, or does for itself anyway, services that are being provided here, and some pretty good ones, because in order to sustain ourselves, we need air and water, and we need energy. So here we're tying the big things that we need in our lives here into the idea of natural resources and natural services. So hopefully you have this idea. Air is there for us. It also controls our climate, the air temperature does, and how that's affected. And also the air will clean itself if there's something going on. So that's a service. The soil, we need the soil, that's our resource, and it really gives us all the start to all the food that we want to eat on this planet, right? It starts with plants. So the soil being able to regenerate and for nutrients to be in there, that's a natural service provided by the soil. So that's what we have going for us. That's what the planet has to offer us. And these are the keys to sustainability, is to keeping that going. There is no waste in nature. Everything in nature is going to be used for something at some point or another. There is no species that has figured out a way to waste other than human beings. But we are reliant on this idea with the soil of nutrient cycling. So when something dies, its nutrients go back into the soil, and then the plants are able to grow, and you can see how that cycle continues. This is called a closed loop. Everything in here benefits the next stage in the loop, and the cycle gets to continue pretty sustainably if you don't monkey with it too much. So there's the idea of the nutrient cycling, one of the principles of sustainability. All right, so very nice to talk about being sustainable environmentally, but there is a bit of a connection here between environmental and economic things as well. So we want to be growing. We have grown as a human species, I think, in our technology and what we can do, but there's a payoff and a trade-off for these things, and we want to be able to be environmentally sustainable, and we also want to be economically okay. Now, this is also coming into your worldview. There are people here, there's a disparity in how people are doing here within this country, right? Some people are more well off than others. And also globally, there's a disparity between that too. So we talk about countries that have a lot of money and countries that don't have a lot of money. And we in the United States would be considered one of the rich countries. But if we're making comparisons and finding out about all the causes and effects, that's a good question right there. How do economies, countries that are so-called rich countries, how do they affect the environment? How do they deal with the environment? How do poor countries do that? How are all of these things connected? So it's a science, so we want to be able to make these comparisons, and here's some of the ways we do it. So we talk about the amount of gross domestic product, that's how much a country would be making in a year, the country itself, cut and dry. And then we introduce this term per capita. So per capita means per person. So that's an important one to have down there. How much per person are we talking about? Is it? Now that's just split up. It doesn't talk about the disparity within a country, but it averages it out per person. And well, different money goes to different there's different money currencies that we're dealing with. Money can buy a different amount in different places. So a way that we can compare this universally is with this PPP here, this purchasing power parity, which just gives you the idea of, for example, how much a loaf of bread would cost different places, and gives you an idea of comparing economies. Okay, so they talk about rich countries as basically being developed, and they talk about poor countries as being developing. I think all countries are still developing, right? The United States is still developing. We're changing all the time. But we're a little bit farther ahead than some places in the world, and you should be thinking about those connections as well. Probably already know something about these things. Now, like a lot of things in our book, these numbers might be off a little bit by now, but they just give an idea here that the difference. We have a lot less population in the developed part of the world. The United States, again, would be developed by this terminology. And according to this terminology, India and China are developing. And yet they have some really great technologies going on and are very developed in some areas. So it's very interesting how they split these things up. But at any rate, in the developed world, we have less people, we get to live longer, we have a lot more wealth, and we use a lot more resources. So hopefully you get the idea that resource use is going to be tied into environmental issues as well. So how are we doing this? What are our ecological footprints? Well, the idea of an ecological footprint is how many Earths we would need to survive. We only have the one Earth, so we want to keep our ecological footprint, as a general idea, less than one, so that we don't use up the Earth that we have. That's the idea here. So we have to be careful about what we're doing there, and that's a big part of what this class is talking about. So a resource is something that we can use, something that's of value to us. Hopefully you can be thinking about resources right now that the Earth has to offer us. This course will involve a lot of that, so hopefully you're thinking about that already. Some of these are right there for us, and some of them we have to go after. And what's the results of that if there's mining going on or something like that? So that's the idea of the resources there, something that we can use. Now we also are getting more and more as human beings into using the solar power. And that is a resource that we don't have to wait for it to replenish. It's always coming our way. Okay, so a renewable resource is going to be one that within the course of a human lifetime could be, could come back to us, a renewable resource. Trees that we use for paper, lumber, building materials, trees would be renewable. They can grow back to us. So what we want to do is we want to take them with what we use them with a sustainable yield. And the idea there is that we don't take more than we'll deplete it over time. And this is something to be thinking about with a lot of our resources, and a big part of what our class is, asks those questions. And also, when we're getting these resources, let's try to learn, as scientists, what we're doing to the environment when we do that. All right, so this is the idea of things that we're doing here, and later on we're going to go into more detail of all these things. But we have not, in all cases, been doing things sustainably. I think we're more aware of it than ever before, so we're making moves in that direction, and this course is part of that as well. But in creating the economies and the lifestyles that we've had, we are creating air pollution. There is a warming of the temperature. Well, that seems to be among debate among people, whether people are really warming the temperature. We'll talk a lot about that, climate change and what people think about that. But there's no doubt that there is more soil erosion, that we've taken more of the trees, and we can talk about the consequences of soil erosion, and there's not too much debate about that. So we have shrunk the forests in some cases, aquifers, underground water supplies, the oceans, all of the resources. We have to take a look at about how we're using them. And now that we've done that, some of these things are coming back as well. The forests are coming back in some places, and so it's what we know and what we do about it that really is the core of this. And those are not always easy decisions. Okay, so a non-renewable resource is something that once we use it, that's it. Now, these things might, you could argue, be renewed in time. Like one of them would be fossil fuels is a non-renewable resource. But you could say, well, no, they came from dinosaurs, so eventually we'll have more fossil fuels. Yes, but not really within the course of a lifetime or so. We're talking about millions and millions of years there. So what are we going to do? Again, all of these topics should bring up a thought process. If that's true, what else could be true? Where do I go with this thought process? So if we have these things that are non-renewable and we want to be sustainable, we have to use them in a wise manner, I guess, or a calculated manner. All right, so reuse and recycle are big words that you're familiar with already too, and that helps with keeping the lifetime of the resource there for us. Okay, so of course the idea here is that we are right from the beginning talking about our population growth, and population control is one of the basic principles of sustainability for all species. And now for the human species, it's very interesting because we're really growing and we have a pretty big, good growth rate, enough that the population is jumping up pretty quickly here, and we have to think about sustainability in those terms as well. So how much life can we support? We'll ask that about individual species in their own area and about the human species on the planet as well. How much life can we support? And that number's changing too. Can you think about why that number would be changing? That's a good thought question that can bring up a lot of new connections for you. Okay, so the idea here, and this is, you can see projected footprint for 2010. Well, that's another reason why the book is a little bit out of date here. We're past that. But we've kind of kept up with this here, so, taking into account, and this is again a scientific study here, how much land do we have? How much land do we need per person, per capita, if you will? And are we being sustainable about that? So the idea here is we're already past the Earth's capacity for sustainability. That is debatable also, and it's not debatable that we're using more resources than ever, but the future is not really written here. That's why they're saying projected, and we're coming up with new ideas all the time, and we'll discuss a lot of those in the class as well. All right, so this is the idea. Well, this is the same slide you just saw. And the idea is we have to think about this. So as I said at the beginning, we were not into agriculture. For the longest time, human beings were just hunting and gathering. But when they found out they didn't have to follow the food source, when they figured out agriculture, that was a pretty big jump up for human beings. And then the energy that we took out of the ground, mainly starting with coal and then going on to oil, fossil fuels in general, led to this industrial revolution, and we've made these medical breakthroughs as well. So that's dramatically changed life expectancy in society and all of that. And now we're in another revolution, and that's the idea of the information out there is so available and instantaneously from every part of the earth. So if this course is about trying to find connections, we're in a position now with our technology to be able to see the connections at lightning speed, really, and make many more connections as possible. So we can do that with our technology right now. Or play video games. A lot of really great video games are out there too, so we decide. But hopefully you're picking up on some of the environmental stuff, and in doing that you're also seeing how your world works and how your changing world works, and maybe you can decide how you're going to change your changing world a little bit. How you can have your effect on it as well. All right, so this is a pretty obvious one here. Preventing pollution is better than just polluting in the first place. Well, these are easy concepts to grasp, but then each question or concept opens up a whole line of questioning. And in this class, we're going to be wanting to name names with pollution, and we're going to want to name names with the ways we can prevent it and the ways we have to clean it up when we haven't prevented it. And of course, it is easier to prevent it from happening than to clean it up. It's also easier to keep up with your AP reading and outlining than it is to try to do it at the last minute. So hopefully you're keeping up with that too. We'll try to make as many tie-ins as we can here. Okay, so we want to name names, and for right now we're going to do broad strokes with that, and then we're going to fill it in with real cases with real pollution and what's going on and what we have to be concerned with. So sources of pollution, point sources, we know where they come from, like a smokestack, and the non-point you don't really know. Maybe there's agricultural runoff, but there's a lot of agriculture. It's into the water goes downstream. We know there's some pollution in there perhaps, but we don't know where it came from exactly. That's one. Even cars, car exhaust is non-point. They're constantly moving. You don't know where they're going to be. But a pipe into the water, we can kind of track that down to where it comes from. All right, so some of these pollutants are biodegradable. That means they'll be naturally broken down over time, and some are not. So that means they're going to be there for a long time. And I think a lot of this pollution started with us learning some new things and ways that we can make our lives easier. And then there were these unintended consequences of the pollution, and then we have to think about that aspect as well. Okay, so we can talk about, well, this is just another way, a fancier way, I guess, of talking about preventing and cleaning up. The cleanup is the output, and the input would be the pollution prevention. So we've been moving more toward the input, and historically it's been more just output, and then we found out what the problems were, and we had to deal with them on the fly. But we're a little bit more informed than we were in the past. Okay, so I think you can already be starting to think about why we have these problems. We have people, and people's lives have changed, and I think for the better, but that means there's a cost for that as well. So something that we have to take into account. We like our lives the way they are, but what are the environmental consequences of some of that? So that's the thing. So we have more people than we've had before. We also traditionally, or recently anyway, haven't been so concerned with the waste that we do, especially in the United States. But we're getting more aware of that too, but there's a lot of waste that goes on. When people are poor, they can't be thinking about conserving the environment. They have to think about what they can do to survive. And some of those things in the developing and developed world have consequences on the environment. Okay, and sometimes we just didn't know what we were doing, and we leave the cost of cleanup for the environment sometimes to the people. So it really costs us more in the end, maybe through tax dollars, to do some of this cleanup, but that doesn't come in our consumer goods. We buy them at one price, but then there's this extra amount that we're going to be paying for cleanup and things like that. Okay, so this is just the idea of here people have it a lot worse than we do, and these are people who don't have access to some things that we probably take for granted. And like I said again, when you're living in poverty, it's kind of hard to be thinking about what you're supposed to be doing environmentally when you're trying to survive. So hopefully none of us are lacking any of these good things here. These numbers might have changed a little bit too since the presentation was put together. But that's something we'll look into in class as well. Okay, so poverty can have its problems, but affluence, that means we have a lot of money. So we would be considered to be an affluent country, the United States would. And because of that, we want more things, and these things here have environmental consequences as well, the resources that we have to use for them. Think of your smartphones. There's materials in there that have environmental consequences. Really, you can't look at any kind of economic things that we do and remove it from the environment, and the other way around too. Okay, so this is what I was saying before. That you pay maybe for some of the things later on if there's a cleanup or something like that. But maybe if people paid a little bit more when they bought the product, maybe they would be a little less wasteful. That could be something to think about. Okay, and another big part of this is, and there's always going to be these questions, well, what's good for the environment? What's good for the economy? We want both things to be strong. I guess all of us probably do, but there's going to be a balance for that. There's going to be a trade-off and there's going to be a payoff. So the way you look at these things is going to affect what you think the solution should be. And of course, we're not always going to have the same views on what those solutions would be. But hopefully we can understand the other people's perspective. You know, people might look at it differently than we do. And that's the connections, you know. We're all working in this together, so the connections are a good thing to be looking for as well. Even if you disagree with somebody, really good to understand maybe their standpoint or their point of view or where they're coming from. Okay, well, and I guess as a follow-up to that one, there is really only one environment. So, you know, we should all be thinking about that together. Okay, so we're part of this class is to become more informed about environmental topics and discussions, and that's what environmental science is about as well, too. Try to make informed decisions, and the science is constantly evolving as well. So our knowledge of this stuff is growing, and now you're part of that too. Okay, so what are the 4 basic principles? We've discussed a few of them here already. If not all of them, and these are the things. Well, actually, we haven't mentioned biodiversity, and we have talked about solar energy and population and the nutrient cycling, but biodiversity means that we're going to need all different kinds of life forms in order for it to work. You know, just a simple thing that you could be talking about here is if you like eating a hamburger, I guess you'd have to say you're relying on the soil being good, so there has to be bacteria that's able to survive in the soil, that is able to grow the plants that the cow will eat, that you can now have your hamburger. Biodiversity is very a great way of talking about all the different connections. I happen to like eagles. I think they're pretty interesting to see. But an eagle is a bird of prey, you know, so they're like human beings up on the food chain. And in order for them to survive, then there has to be a whole food chain and food web full of all kinds of different things working together. And you might think, well, what if we take them out, the eagles? Well, then some of these prey species would maybe overrun some of the other natural resources that we have. Maybe now there's way more bunny rabbits because there's not as many eagles and there's less grass than before. So everything is connected here, and that's why biodiversity is a big one as well. All right, well, that's chapter 1. Thank you for joining in. and bring any questions you have back to class, and I look forward to seeing you there.